Hello. Good morning, and welcome to our Disciples Women's Retreat. First order of business, be sure and turn the volume off on your cell phone so that it's not interrupting anybody. And just one other order of business, on your name tags, in the lower left-hand corner, there is a symbol. Now that symbol is, you're going to match them all up at lunchtime. Whatever your symbol is, that's who you're going to eat lunch with. So that way you get to know new people. So we want that order of business out of the way so we can get started with the day. So I'm going to turn it over to, you said Lisa? Lisa. Yeah. Lisa from South Point, and she is going to welcome you to the church and tell you what you need to know about the church.
Good morning. Welcome to South Point Christian Church. We're glad to have you here, and whether you're in person or listening online, we are pleased that you're here. Just a couple things. Restrooms are back this way by the drinking fountains. We've got coffee. We've got hot water for tea. The water is in the kitchen. We can get that for you. Let me know if the temperature isn't good in here. I can. It's that tricky time of year where, it'll be hot this afternoon, but it'll be chilly this morning. So other than that, if you have any questions, just ask me, and we are so glad to have all of you here.
Good morning again. It's great to have all of you here today. I'm Linda Waldron, and I am your president for the Nebraska Region Disciple Women, and so I'm glad to be here to help you. And if you've got questions during the day, I'll try and answer them, or if not, I will turn it over to Angie. Angie, will you stand up, please? Angie Emmons, Nebraska City. She is our new Disciple Women Coordinator. After Teresa retired, Angie has moved into that position. She has a great bio on our website for the region, and there was a newsletter too, so hopefully you can get acquainted with Angie, and she's been great to be getting going on us. Our vice president is Tana Skarniak from Grand Island. And Tana, I used to be the vice president, and so they gave me this wonderful little pin, so I will be passing it on to you as vice president. Thank you for volunteering to do that. We have two members at large, Kay Cook from Southview, and the other one is Nancy Schmidt from Fairbury. Yay. So we have, that's our official cabinet, but hopefully you are aware that we've been doing Zoom meetings, and we've had a number of the people that have joined in on our Zoom meetings. So if you've attended on our Zoom meetings, please raise your hand. Yay, thank you. Our goal is to have one representative from each disciple church in Nebraska, so we are working on it, and unfortunately, this is one of the few times we've been able to get together in person instead of on these little screens. So thank you all for being here for that, and we do still have an opening for secretary. So if anybody is so inclined that would like to help be our secretary, we would be glad to welcome you onto the cabinet as well. Thanks.
I'm reading from Ruth, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. But Ruth said, Well, first of all, this is an excerpt from the book Liberating Love, a daily devotional written by Sandra Jaw. And the way it is written is she gives you a scripture, and then the written portion is as it's written by God. And so the scripture is Ruth, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." I love how to this very day, this passage about my faithful servant Ruth is used in wedding ceremonies all over the world as people can commit themselves fully to each other. What people sometimes forget is that part of the reason this beautiful story ended up in the Bible is because my children had forgotten my teaching to love the stranger and show compassion for the foreigner. This story of Ruth's deep commitment to her mother-in-law, who came from a different culture, was intended to remind them and you that people different from you can model for you the deepest commitment, love, and faith can give you strength in hard times. I meant you to know all the beautiful diversity of my creation. I made you in my image, and I am so big that I needed billions of people to capture the fullness of my divinity. Let that sink in. I meant you to know all the beautiful diversity of my creation. I made you in my image, and I am so big that I needed billions of people to capture the fullness of my divinity. I invite you today to reflect on how you can deepen your connections to the people, the parts of my image you don't know yet. When I read that line the first time about the billions of people, it was a hit in the head, because I always thought people are made in the image of God, but the part about the diversity being a part of God it never connected for me. And so that made a big connection. And so I hope that makes a connection for you. And I thought that it was especially appropriate today when we're going to learn about two different cultures today, and that how he wants us to spread his love and his peace to everyone. If you would pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to be together in person today, and for the love that you give us, and for the word that you have brought to us every day. I thank you for all the people gathered and all the ones that are watching, and for all the people that have come before us, so that we can have a wonderful day today. And thank you for the many blessings that you send our way. Amen.
Well, welcome again to this place. That's how this morning already went. Great. I don't normally do anything from a seat, but I thought for 2 hours I would opt for that, and we see I don't normally do that. So as Angie told you, I am the pastor here at South Point Christian Church. I've been here for about 2.5 years now, moving here from Phoenix, Arizona. I grew up independent Christian churches and Churches of Christ in northeastern Kentucky. Also went to college within that tradition. and then went to seminary in Atlanta, Georgia at Emory University, Candler School of Theology. It is almost 14 years since my ordination, as of next month, coming almost a pretty straight route. And I ended up here. I have special training in interim ministry and was called here as transitional pastor. I could serve for 2 years and then be called a settled pastor. And as many of you know, along the line, we added Trinity Chapel in partnership with South Point here. So it's always a new adventure. I also want to introduce my partner, who is the guy in the back, Matthew Clark. He is our live streamer and our sound guy and our music guy and all of those things. Yes. So his day job is with the Christian church in Arizona. He is their administrator and works from the spare bedroom here in Nebraska. But that has been a pretty good shift for most people. He gets to work much earlier than he used to, thanks to the time difference. But I am thankful he was able to be here this morning. So, Disciples Women's Ministry, Woman to Woman Worldwide. This is one of the pilgrimages that takes place, I think they're moving to try and every other year, visiting someplace where we have partners through global ministries and seeing what they do there. This was actually the first one following the 2020 pandemic, the first time kind of undertaking this after COVID. So technically called the Pilgrimage to Southeast Asia, specifically Japan and Korea. Global Ministries is launching a specific Pacific Basin initiative, and so you might have heard about that as well. So that was part of choosing this trip. Here is our lovely traveling group. Derek Duncan, the only man in that picture, is the Global Ministry staff person who works in Southeast Asia. He is the one that keeps our partnerships ongoing with all of these places and all of these people. I have to say it was a privilege to get to travel with him because he was clearly a welcome friend for everyone who was there. And they knew him, they loved him, and definitely made us feel more welcome because of him. This trip had 11 people total on it. So 11 of us kind of traveling in a pack throughout Japan using the bullet train, and then mostly in Seoul and surrounding areas in Korea. I'm going to do a few things during this presentation. One is there will be some history of Japan and Korea because you need a bit of that to understand the context of both mission and ministry and our partnerships. Both countries were occupied during somewhat recent wars, so that's part of this story as well. Especially talking about Hiroshima and Japan, there'll be some graphic details, and sexual slavery is one of the dominant themes arising out of World War II. The same thing, rape and prostitution are kind of ongoing conversations. And so I'm not going to do the pornographic version of anything, telling you something just for the sake of telling you, for being a spectator. But I do just want you to know that content will be in here, and it's part of our history, it's part of their history, it's also a reality of what continues to go on in those countries. So my invitation to you is, if there's something here that is difficult for you to hear in a not healthy way, difficult to hear in a healthy way is one thing, but an unhealthy way, you're welcome, you're invited to take care of yourself. Do whatever you need, step out if you need to. There's sound in the lobby, so you can kind of hear what's going on. You can check out entirely. There's a very ugly but very comfortable rocking chair in the nursery that, you can go chill out as well. I will stop at several intervals throughout the presentation to give you a chance to ask questions. And When you ask a question, I'm going to repeat it so that everyone can hear, especially on our live stream, because anything we say in this room that is not on a microphone will not get picked up. So the live stream is going. Hopefully we have some people enjoying. It will also be captured on YouTube, so if later you want to share, you're welcome to share those links. And I will make sure Angie and Tana and Linda all have those links for you. We're going to do morning session in one link and then afternoon session in another, rather than share dead air for an hour. That didn't seem like the best plan. The other part that just kind of is a precursor to everything is both of these countries have a heavy U.S. military presence. And neither of the countries are particularly happy about that at all times. Some of this is what it reveals about our country, about our country's foreign policy. And some of it is going to be inherently political. There's no way around it. You will even, maybe not from me, but if you check out the materials that I brought, you'll hear U.S. militarism or U.S. imperialism and sort of their reactions to that. While you're milling about, there's a table over here. The tall table is all stuff from Korea. The low table is all stuff from Japan. So I invite you to look at that as well. So let's jump in a little bit. And I did want to frame this somewhat theologically. So I want to start with a scripture that's familiar. This is a scripture from the book of Acts. It is on the day of Pentecost when there's the coming of the Holy Spirit. And I put it up so you can see it a little. I know it's not the biggest it could be, but that saved me from multiple slides. But you have them all gathered in one place. There's a sound like mighty rushing wind, and then everyone is able to speak. And so here is that story. There were pious Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. When they heard the sound, a crowd gathered. They were mystified because everyone heard them speaking in their native languages. They were surprised and amazed, saying, "Look, aren't all the people who are speaking Galileans, every one of them? We are from Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Iran, Iraq, Israel, and many parts of Turkey, including near Istanbul and Ankara. Some of us are from Egypt and northern Libya, and some are visiting from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism. Some are from the island of Crete or from Saudi Arabia. We hear them declaring the mighty works of God in our own language." They were all surprised and bewildered. Some asked each other, "What does this mean?" Others jeered at them, saying, "They're full of new wine." So, if you make it to Women's Retreat on a Saturday, I assume you've heard the scripture before, but I know I could be wrong. So you get a sound like a mighty rushing wind. People are wondering what's going on, and their immediate response is, well, they must be drunk. Now, if you heard this story preached on a few times, you've probably heard it is a reversal of the Tower of Babel. So you get the Genesis story where people are essentially getting too much power, and so they try to build this tower to get all the way to God, because in the ancient Near Eastern world, that's where God lives, above. And so God says, oh, well, we don't want them to cooperate too much, and so changes their language so they can't communicate with each other, and then scatters them over the face of the earth. That's one of those origin stories we get about what happened. But then in this great reversal that happens, all of a sudden people are able to speak to one another. And that ability comes because of the gift of the Spirit that Jesus promised them. But we always remember that's rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ. So yes, while the Spirit is working with them, it's becoming a part of their daily lives as it is ours. It is because of that participation in the gospel that they are able to do that. And so one of the things that we have to work really hard to believe and to assume is that this is still true. this great reversal, this bringing together that happens is still true for us. It is true for our partners in ministry, and it's especially true for the people we call brothers and sisters through global ministries. We believe that the call of the gospel matters more than anything else, including nationality. And so I say that for how we receive the stories from especially our sisters here in Japan and Korea. But I say that even as someone who recognizes my privilege in all of this. You know, I went into this trip with a U.S. passport. And so there is some bit of privilege that comes with at every border check, at every time I have to show that passport, I am showing a piece of privilege. And that safety and privilege especially matters as we get into the political realities, the political history, what is going now, and some of it is brutal. And I especially know that some of it will be a lot to wrestle with, but I also believe that was no less true for the believers who were gathered on the day of Pentecost. So out of those countries listed, it's our tradition here to use this version that has modernized countries, so rather than the Elamites and Persians and those that you're like, I don't know what an Elamite is, you get this one that tells you where these places are and who these places reflect. And so if you look at that list, there are conflicts happening there now. There are conflicts that were surely happening in the ancient world. So when I think of even the disparate nature of everything here, I have to believe that was no less true for the people who were gathered on the day of Pentecost and were surprised that they were welcomed when they were from Egypt or Libya or those sorts of things. And in this particular scenario, I happen to believe that if the people in these countries can call me their sister and they can welcome me with incredibly generous hospitality, then I can receive their stories and I can share their stories. And I trust that the Spirit allows us to do more with that than we could ever imagine. And allows us to even see beyond our own political borders to the nation, to the kingdom of God. And I was indeed welcomed with great hospitality. You can ask me, I didn't go so much on the personal stories, but ask me anything you want during presentation time. One of the signs of generous hospitality is we ate beef at every single turn because fish is cheap in what they have every day, so they're not going to give that to guests. Chicken's a little bit better, but beef is the thing you show guests, or you give guests, and by the end of it, we're like, can we have anything but beef? We've eaten that for like 3 meals a day, at least 2 for 2.5 weeks. So that's just one of the ways that they showed great hospitality to us. So we're going to start with Japan because that's where the trip started. I will spend a little bit longer talking about Japan because we were able to see more in Japan. We were able to meet with more leaders. We were able to see more of the ministries that they are doing there. And all of these ministries are going to be ones that we support in some way, financially or otherwise, through our partnership with Global Ministries. So Japan itself, you probably know, is an island nation. It was actually a closed nation for many years. So during the Edo period, from 1603 to 1868, it was pretty much isolated. Nobody went in, nobody went out. The beginning of that period is actually Jesuit missionaries had been there in the 1500s, and then part of that was they were closing off everything, even to Christianity, during that time. When they reopened to the Western world, it was by force with just pressure from the outside countries, including the United States. And some of that began with Emperor Meiji, whose time opened up the Meiji period. When Japan became modernized, they became wealthy, and that period is 1868 to 1912. Now, coming into modernization, sort of as the industrial age and U.S. is forming and all of those things are taking place, means that they also, while they interacted with the world, they didn't take on the other cultures maybe like other places did. So Japan is, to this day, a nearly homogeneous culture. It was Japanese, it is Japanese. It is unusual to see people who are not Japanese there. Considered both culturally and ethnically homogeneous, with I think around 97% of the population being Japanese. Because of that, they're also only 1% Christian. They are predominantly Shinto and Buddhist. And Shinto in particular, the very traditional buildings you'll see, the shrines you see are all Shinto shrines, and those are all tied to that tradition. And Shinto itself is hard to separate from the culture. It is very common among people to combine kind of traditions. So, you might have practiced Christianity, but you still will be buried in a Shinto tradition or get married with some Shinto features. And for even people who consider themselves devout Christians, this is one of those struggles of this is so ingrained in our culture, we're not even sure what is Shinto and what is Japanese. Now, the early 20th century, as you probably know, that end of the Meiji period was about the beginning of World War I. And during all of those years, Japan was seeing increased militarization. That was the time in which they gained control of the Korean Peninsula. And then during World War II, they were allies with Nazi Germany and were considered among the Axis powers. So all of that is just to remind you of, maybe tell you the first time some of their history, remind you of some of the reasons visiting from the U.S. might be especially interesting, and in some places difficult for them. I have to say, we did not experience that at all. We were warmly welcomed, but it was evident from some other conversations that was not always the case. Now, them being 1% of the population actually meant that we received a very, very warm welcome. They're the minority, so they were excited to have other Christians there and to talk about what they're doing because they are such a small portion in their country. Our partners there are the United Church of Christ in Japan. Do not confuse that with the United Church of Christ that we are partners with, as disciples, even in global ministries. They are simply all the churches that were there that were united, and before World War II, they were required to unite into a single denomination. I do not know how that works. I do not know how they forced that, but that was their narration. We were required to unite, and so we became the United Church of Christ. They were, as I said, eager to see us, to call us friends, to talk about faith. It was also very, very common to find people who speak English across Japan and Korea. So while there's some translation that's happening, a lot of this was just directly from people. Most of them most people we met could hold a conversation in English. And they might have to ask specific words or something like that, but regardless of their age, they were usually what I would consider fluent. Japan considers its economic future as such that English has now become compulsory in elementary schools. So very standard to speak English to assume that that is kind of where their future would be. And in Japan especially, it was very common to find things written in Japanese and English. If they spoke a second language, it would almost universally be English. Just a side note. So I'm going to turn to the specific ministries and places we visited. Again, I'll stop along the way for questions, so I will try to not go too far. But I want to start our time with a hymn from the first ministry we'll talk about. And so you probably don't know these words, but you do know the tune. It's to the tune of Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. So I invite you to join in singing Bring the Feast to Every Hillside. Institute. Let's try that again. The first ministry we're going to talk about is called Asian Rural Institute. And for me, this was one of the most interesting, partly because of my own kind of theological background and interests. So I just go ahead and say that up front, that I really enjoyed this place and the work they were doing. So their goal is to teach organic farming to people all over the developing world. And so I'll go into some more details about how they do that and what they do. But this is a photo taken in their chapel. So if you notice, the speaker is sitting down. And so their chapel is actually built so that there's about 3 or 4 levels, and the movable parts are all going to create more levels. Because the idea is not that if you are the leader, that you would stand up front and elevated as I am, but instead that you would be below the other people to model servant leadership. So their motto is that we may live together. And this particular person sitting with us had written that we may live together there. And so the question is, in that motto, what is the most important word? What is the thing that matters most, that kind of drives whatever goes on at the farm? Now, that's a long conversation they want to be clear that this is creating a sustainable world, something that everyone could do, and we would not use up resources, we would not destroy our planet. So they emphasize three things within that motto: servant leadership, food life, and a community of learning. So servant leadership, they focus on personal growth, on spiritual growth. They want to teach people awareness, to practice mindfulness, and part of servant leadership is to empower the marginalized. Food life is kind of their own word that they use, and even in Japanese, it's not a usual word. But this is a reminder that everything is connected. All of our food is connected. All of our lives are connected together. And so, whatever we do, we're keep in mind how that impacts the world around us. And a community of learning, they work very hard to have an equitable community of learning. One of the shocks for people there is gender is not considered a task assignment. So the men are made to cook, sometimes much to their chagrin, but that is part of what they do. So they invite leaders from throughout the developing world of all faiths. There are 30 people about who come each year. 30 is their maximum. And from April to December, they are in residence at the Institute. While they're there, English is the shared language. So you have to have some English at least if you're going to come and study there. And it's not an insignificant commitment. Once you're there, you don't go home. So people are often leaving children, leaving family for the entire time. And the cost of the program ends up being about $20,000 American, which again is significant. They work to find scholarships, they work to help people come, and nobody gets turned away because of inability to pay. But getting them there is no small feat, as well as the tuition itself. In your folders today, you have a flyer from ARI that actually tells you all about the students from 2023. Their new class just started, so that one's not up yet. But it will have some of their history, some of their background. So I wanted to make sure you have that. On the very back, there's also a map of where their students have come from during their time, the time that they've been open at ARI. And so within that, you'll see lots of women, because they do prioritize the leadership of women in communities that have not traditionally recognized that leadership. And ARI itself was founded by Christians. It was actually founded out of the seminary that is not too far from there. But they broke it off in order to make it more accessible, to invite anyone there. But as I talk, you'll see that there's still this Christian undergirding to everything, even as it looks very, very different. So a principle of organic farming is that you have everything you need. You have everything you need already. You don't have to buy anything to farm organically. And so, while we would say conventional farming, typically, they say chemical farming. And if you have ever been on, especially an industrial farm in the US, you know that it is indeed chemically based farming. There are pesticides at almost every step. There are herbicides. There are all sorts of things that happen. And if you are doing chemical farming, you must spend money. Even if you're fertilizing your lawn, you know that bag of fertilizer has gotten more and more expensive over the years. Nitrogen-based fertilizers, which we don't actually need in Nebraska, we need the other things, are especially expensive, and we're having trouble getting the fertilizer we need. So organic farming says you have everything you already need. I brought a couple what look like very gross pictures. But here on the left, they need to get some good organisms introduced to make some fresh dirt, which they do. They have a method called bokashi, where they speed up the compost process to take about 7 days instead of months. And one of the ways they do it is they put some rice in a log, they tie it up, and they stick it out in the woods where the bugs can get it. And then they have a nice starter for their compost. They stick it in a heap, and then they cover it. Within about a week, you have some very nice, rich, fresh compost and dirt. The other thing is actually fertilizer that is made out of eggshells. So they use eggshells as fertilizer and peppers as insect repellent. And while we were there, they were teaching us how to do this, because one of the goals is they'll go back and share this with their communities. So we were their guinea pigs for their teaching class. We broke up into different things and different groups. So things like that become valuable so that they don't spend the money to grow food that we would expect. I am a farm kid, by the way. So I say all of that with very real knowledge of tobacco farming in particular, but I grew up on a tobacco and cattle farm. When you garden, when you especially garden this way, you're able to feed communities, especially communities where food security is an issue. You are likely to be able to then have enough food to sell, which provides additional income. And part of what they're learning is, how do we adapt to climate change? What can they do? What practices can they take back to their communities to implement in a different setting? So while, they're growing rice and serving rice 3 times a day at ARI, they're learning practices that will carry forward in lots of ways. It is a commitment to live in community, and I would say within Christian community in some way. So this is on the wall in the dining area. And let's see, right here, if you blew that up and could see it from where you are, it's the Superman blessing. Oh, the Lord's been good to me, and so I thank the Lord. Right there. Doxology that most of us would know, some of the other ones as well. So you walk into this room, and it looks like plenty of church camps that I've been to. And so, much like church camp, everyone gathers, they sing a song, and they share a blessing before each meal. Every single meal is eaten in community, and what you are served that day just depends on who is doing the cooking. So if one of the Ghanaians is doing the cooking, you're likely to have some more Ghanaian flair to your food. But it just depends. There's daily morning worship, learning communities morning and afternoon. And one of the things that actually surprised me is, so often when you hear about organic and sustainability, you assume they're going to also talk about being vegetarians. They are not assuming vegetarian. They are not moving toward that. And they say most of our students, culturally, eating meat is important, and they're not going to become vegetarian. So why would we not teach them about animals? So there are lots of goats, sheep, and pigs. Goats in particular, common in African countries as a source of food. They had one cow for a while, but after the Fukushima disaster that we'll talk about later, she went off to live someplace else, because in most of the countries, cattle aren't one of the sources of food. But if you're going to practice sustainability and mindfulness and awareness, then one of the things that they learn to do is to both care for the animals, a little bit more kindly maybe than they would otherwise. And it is also often talked about that you thank the animal for its life, because it is giving its life for you, and you would do anything to protect your own life and to keep yourself alive. So this honoring, again, of food life, and everything is connected. So from that, the things that I find particularly impressive is they definitely practice what they preach. And so between guests and residents and staff and all of that, they feed about 100 people every day. There'll be a few more people there for lunch, not quite as many for breakfast and dinner, but the average sits somewhere around 100 people a day. Their kitchen budget to feed that many people is $400 a month. And they do it, and they often have extra left in the budget. They're working toward zero cost, anything they buy from outside. So one of the things they just put in was a place to press their own oil. So they'll be able to refine their own soybean oil and then cut that out of their food budget entirely as well. So it's not just this idea, it is one of those places where they work very hard that we reflect the practices that we have, that we hope to instill in other communities. Including, we had goat loaf, meatloaf, I don't know, goat meatloaf, while we were there. And that was what they were serving for lunch that day, along with, vats of rice about this big. So part of their ongoing life together is commitment to sustainability within their community. So what other questions do you have about Asian Rural Institute?
Well, you said that you had beef.
Mm-hmm.
Was that there too?
So there, they did not do beef because the countries where people are coming from do not do beef.
Okay.
So, we'll say Korea was much more beef driven, also higher level of income, especially among the churches. There it was mostly predominantly goats. They had sheep, they had pigs, they had some chickens, but goat was kind of understood, especially for the African countries, as their default meat source. And
So what would a breakfast look like if the lunch and dinner is like goat and rice?
so breakfast, the question was what would breakfast look like? So rice is served at every single meal. And that is true, Japan and Korea both. Rice is your staple. Japan especially, they will provide seasoning, if you're eating at a hotel, there's almost a seasoning buffet, so you can flavor your rice in different ways. But rice would be present at every meal. Fish and eggs are very common breakfast foods, as well as fruits. Next, we'll talk some about the Fukushima disaster and that. Fruit is more likely to take up radiation than vegetables are. So their fruit consumption has changed some as they're measuring that because they are near the Fukushima prefecture where that disaster was. So, but yeah, fish and eggs, very common. Eggs, if you watch TikToks, if you watch any videos and you see these little round eggs like this, where it's almost like the perfect shape with the yolk in the middle, that is super common to see on breakfast buffets in lots of places. But you fill up on rice is the short answer.
I'm sorry. And then a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So do they have somebody from the community that is assigned to go and fish every day? Or do they buy their fish in market?
So at ARI, they only eat what they grow. And I don't remember if they had a fishery going or not, because you can have a fishery. They are pretty isolated from the community. The exception is they have a Becquerel meter. That is what you use to test radiation, and that has become their connection to the community because people are bringing food there to be tested to see if the levels are safe. Before that, ARI itself is kind of an island. And it feels very not Japanese if you're Japanese and very Japanese if you're not Japanese. Because you still take off your shoes when you enter and those sorts of things. But it's a very sort of eclectic place. Yes, Michael.
Couple of questions. Is there an age that they try and focus on for people that are coming to the institute?
so the question was, is there an age to focus on? It's usually 25 to 45. You have to have been a leader in your community for 3 years, and they're wanting you to be able to make a significant impact with the information you learn. They do take volunteers. So if you're looking to spend a few weeks in Japan as a volunteer, ARI has a place for you. It is not air conditioned, and there's heavy lifting, but, but they have a place for you.
And the second question is, they're bringing folks from all these different areas to this place. So is there a way to kind of summarize how they build that community that they are?
Yeah, so how to summarize to build the community. We didn't get into that a lot. Several of them are referrals from other people within their countries and communities. If you look at that map where people come from, you'll see clusters of where they're from. There are a significant number of people from Japan who come and study there. But I don't know what they're doing particularly beyond that. It seems like they have a decent applicant pool. Even post-COVID, that stalled them. For 1 year, they didn't run classes because of that. Or they ran a much smaller group, I think was how it ended up. Sally?
Yeah, I'm just gonna ask, how long a time have they been in existence to build up to get to the point of getting an express service?
How long? I want to say 60s, 70s. And I think on that flyer, it might be there. There's 1,399 students total.
Oh, yes, it does say they're celebrating the 50th anniversary.
There. See? Sometimes I make up stuff well.
It's interesting, I don't see graduates from the United States.
So the question was graduates from the United States. They're focused on the developing world and places that this might matter. One of the things that's kind of a background conversation would be, could they do a second location in the U.S. focusing on Native American communities? Recognizing these are communities that would benefit from these practices, kind of a developing nation within our existing system in a developed world. So that is something they've talked about, but it is a focus on developing world, not industrialized nations.
When we went on Woman to Woman and we were in the West Virginia area, there were a lot of really poor places that, something like this would be there, because they had been tobacco farmers and were no longer, so, there was not a transition made for them.
Yeah, and when you're talking about, so I grew up on the Kentucky-West Virginia border. So when you're talking about like McDowell County and that sort of area, you do get incredibly high poverty rates. And yes, one of the things that I think they would be open to someone if there were an ongoing how do we develop, because you have to have 3 years of service in your community. They're bringing already trusted leaders. So when I think of that, if there was someone working on, what do we farm in Hills now, what replaces tobacco, either as a cash crop or to make our community sustainable, that they would definitely be open to that if there was some kind of organization, ongoing sort of thing, an agency behind it. Yeah, I mean, Appalachia has mostly not gotten any of those places back, even like with Appalachian Service Project and some of those things that exist. So, yeah. All right, Angie.
Was there ever any conflict between the people?
There was. I mean, you live with people, you live with other countries. There definitely is a conflict. There was one of the open ones that I heard was like, you expect us to eat rice 3 times a day? What? And gendered things in particular, that men aren't used to being in the kitchen and expect cultures that don't expect that. and even ones who would not necessarily go back to their cultures and end up in the kitchen, there was a different respect for what women in their cultures did and managed. So that was very interesting to see. Yes, Tanya?
How did the government react to this?
I have no idea on what. I know it was originally tied to a seminary that existed. I don't know anything else ongoing. They're essentially an educational institution, so they comply with those regulations. So. All right. Seeing no other burning questions, we're going to talk some about the church in the Fukushima prefecture. Prefecture is like a state. So when they talk about the Fukushima disaster, they talk mostly locally about that state. If you remember, Fukushima prefecture was the site of the 2011 triple disaster. It's just north of ARI, kind of midway up the main island. And on March 11th, 2011, they were struck by a magnitude 9 earthquake. The earthquake triggered a tsunami. When the tsunami made landfall, there was a Fukushima Daiichi plant meltdown. And so there remains a small area that's uninhabited. It was rated the same on whatever scale they use as the Chernobyl disaster, but about 10% of the same matter was released as at Chernobyl. It's still, though, there remains an exclusion zone, and there's a lot of people asking questions. What about us? What about the people living here? Is this really safe? And I couldn't find a picture of Terumi, but we met Terumi, who is a member of United Church of Christ in Japan. Her husband is a pastor. She is not. Her husband loves Bob Marley and wears Birkenstocks and is Japanese, in case you're wondering. Terumi is kind of the opposite of that and is this force to be reckoned with. So she is one of the ones pushing and organizing for a different response to the ongoing nuclear concerns. Initially, there was evacuation of an area. There's an exclusion zone established. They removed a meter of topsoil, so about 3 feet, from the entire affected area, and they left them in bags around the countryside, which is what you see here. They stacked up bags of dirt in an effort to remove what was contaminated. They also had to use considerable water to cool down the power plant. And so now, almost 13 years later, they're asking, well, what do we do with these things? The bags are degrading. The water was stored for a lot of that time. It was treated. Many people would say not as much as it needed to be. And it was then released into the Pacific Ocean last August. It will reach California in about 5 years. So for as far away as it is, the political decisions here still affect us. And Terumi was one of the leaders saying, please don't release this water. They're not convinced things are safe. The government kind of changes the guidelines and standards. So they have what I mentioned before, a becquerel meter. And ARI's is a very large, stable becquerel meter. There's a pamphlet on it back there. The churches have like a becquerel meter in a bag. Kind of looks like one of the old bag phones, just a little satchel that you hang. So ARI is testing the food that they grow. The local kindergarten is bringing their food once a week and having it tested, and they're willing to test neighbors' foods as well. The church and their people kind of have one that they'll just bring and test as needed. So they were testing on their playground where their kids play. Well, they found out that because when rain falls, when snow falls, it collects. And so it collected at the bottom of the slide. So the slide had too high a radiation area where the kids would hit when they came off the slide. So the church took out their slide because this isn't safe. And so those sorts of questions that they're wondering, what do we do? What do we do with our environment? What else needs to happen? They also ended up offering testing for kids' uniforms. So most kids wear uniforms to school. They get passed down from kid to kid, and shoes as well. And so people have been told they were safe, and then when they tested the fabric, even after many launderings, it wasn't safe. And so they're throwing out uniforms, and at the same time the parents are saying, if we had known, we would have bought new uniforms. They told us they were safe. So they're trying to figure out if it's safe, forcing some transparency about guidelines, and including relocation if needed. The Japanese church as a whole, I would say, has a strong opposition to nuclear, both power and missiles. And that's an interesting kind of interplay in Japan especially. Japan itself relies on nuclear power extensively. More than 30% of their power is derived from nuclear. They were on track for 40% prior to the Fukushima disaster. So they are still wrestling with what that means and what they can do to kind of force the government's hand. We met and talked with them in their conference room, and while I was there, I snapped a picture of their sanctuary. I told you they were about 1% of the population. This is one of the larger churches in Japan, larger Christian churches, and one of the wealthier Christian churches. And as you can see, their sanctuary itself is quite small. Along with everything related to nuclear, I gave you a picture of a bento lunch that they served us, because when you don't have another picture, I figured food was close enough. They have a program called, and I didn't write the acronym down, so I don't know, IWAN, that's in Fukushima. But they are the people who are also teaching Japanese to people from other countries. And they are one of the only agencies to do that. We have ELL classes and those things in the US. There's no equivalent in Japan. But the church started this many years ago, actually about 40. So they began it because in the 80s, especially the 90s, when Japan became wealthier, they found out the women from the fishing villages wanted to leave the fishing villages, and the men who wanted to stay wanted wives to come to the fishing villages. So there were a lot of foreign women who were essentially willing to come and marry these men. And we were asked like arranged marriages, what's going on? And what we landed on, it was like the in-person version of Match. So mutual consent, there's a spark here, but understanding they're coming from another country, which was a step up in life, but a very different culture. So the church began teaching Japanese to these women coming to marry Japanese men in fishing villages, and then helping care for them. But then, as things shifted, it became part of their work overall. They would teach any newcomers some or teach them to speak Japanese and continue to work with them. So when we were there were men, there were women, and the ones who were in the room study that day were from the Philippines. So very different today, but that is definitely part of their work. Questions? Yes, Jay?
I just had a basic, I saw chopsticks. Did you have to use chopsticks all the time?
Yes. We were told if we asked for a fork, they would have one, and that was a lie. So we ate with chopsticks. If you look on the tables, Japan and Korea actually have different styles of chopsticks. So you are probably used to the Japanese style, which is also the Chinese style. So I put a pair back there. And then when we got to Korea, you will see they are very different. You go from like wood that are fairly light and pointed to metal with blunt tips. One was considerably more successful than the other, at least starting out.
Now, how do they set that? Is it set up as part of the educational system overall, or the church just has classes every night, or?
They actually have a building that is just for classes. So it's over a business center. So that's what they do. They have it set up all day. It's easily accessible by public transit. It's where a lot of people gather. So that's what they have done for the one we were at. And so other locations do different things. They might have night classes. At least one church had night classes. But they do have a daytime you can go and learn. All right. We're going to move to Tokyo and talk some about the church there. One of the places we visited in Tokyo was the Women's Action Museum. And so the Women's Action Museum was all about comfort women during World War II. It was very small. It was attached to a university. It's hard to find because Japan is still wrestling with acknowledging the reality of comfort women. If you're not familiar with that, women were taken from villages and they set up in camps as prostitutes to serve the soldiers who were stationed there. It was military sanctioned rape and sexual slavery, and for many, many years it went unacknowledged. August of 1991 was when the first person who had been a comfort woman came forward and shared her story. So the government of Japan has not acknowledged the presence of comfort women. They've not taken extensive responsibility. During World War II, they were taking women as young as 14 girls from their villages, some would say as young as 12, and taking them to these camps. And they were not taking Japanese women overall, predominantly Korean women. Also, rural Japan, Indonesia, Taiwan, and mainland China, the Philippines, Malaysia, Australia, and the Netherlands, as well as Indonesia. But still mostly from Korea, setting up about 145 brothels around the country where soldiers could be. The best count says there were about 200,000 comfort women taken from their homes and to these brothels over the course of mostly World War II. And near the end of World War II, they actually established a few specifically to serve U.S. military personnel who were in country. Their hope is to acknowledge what happened, that they would pay reparations to surviving victims, but this museum was still pretty threatened and very small because it was such a sensitive issue for them. When we get to Korea, you'll see a very, very different story, but the museum wasn't as large as this room at all. This is a picture of their brochure of some of the comfort women who have come forward, and one of the pushes is that this be acknowledged before all of them die. In Japan, as you probably know, people tend to live a very long time, so they still have living former comfort women in Korea and Japan, but they are losing those people, several of them already well over 100 years old. And then moving on from Tokyo, we have Kyoto. Kyoto, we were at this place, which was called the Bazaar Cafe, B-A-Z-A-A-R, not B-I-Z-A-R-R-E. Several of the things on the back table are from there. And it was mostly founded as a place to help people find a place who are struggling. It has been a safe haven for non-Japanese, for LGBT folks, for missionaries who were working there, a job network for people who are outside of Japan, and especially at one point a place for people who were working with people who had HIV and AIDS. There's a considerable social stigma around that, and so they gathered at the Bazaar Cafe. And so it was very interesting to be invited into what is essentially a community on its own, and that's their primary existence. But we happened to make it there for a birthday party, and it was Bazaar Cafe's birthday party. It also happened to be one of our mission coworkers' birthday parties. And so she is there. In Japan, you wear red on your birthday, and the hat is a real thing. And she's blowing out her candles there. I don't have a ton to say about it, but it was a fun place, and felt very welcoming because they were intentionally making space for people who didn't fit elsewhere. Any questions there?
You said the women were taken from their homes
Mm-hmm.
to serve the servicemen.
The military. It was not the U.S. military. The Japanese military took them from their home. The leader of the military's name was Hirohito, and he was the one who figured out we want to do this and establish comfort stations, and then led the kidnap of women from those different places and establishment of them. I didn't put that picture up, but there's a very prominent picture of him in this museum of like, yes, this is the guy we should blame for all of this. So it was Japanese military. And in both the Japan and Korean museums, they have documentation, saying diaries of soldiers who visited and those things, even though they haven't been formally acknowledged yet.
And do they still exist?
They do not. They did not exist after about 1950. When we get to the military base, that's another problem. So, yeah, Jenny.
Unless there was something else going on, there must have been a lot of babies being born.
That is one of those questions that mostly gets unanswered of were there children from this? Presumably, yes. There were weekly visits from doctors to check for sexually transmitted infections. There were weekly doctors who provided abortions. And then many of the conditions were such that a woman would not have been able to carry a baby to term. So not uncommon on a regular day to have 10 to 12 men you service, and more than that when they were kind of in port. So lots of women died from the ongoing assaults, and while yes, there were children born, it's a culture that would not talk about that, and that's one of those things that they're wrestling with, so they don't know who those children were or where they were, even though they definitely exist. Yeah? Yeah, that was what I said. They established a few specifically to serve the U.S., most of those between 1945 and 1950. All right. Next, we did visit Hiroshima, and you probably know the most about Hiroshima, and at the same time, we maybe don't know as much as we think. Both of my grandfathers actually fought in World War II. One was an expert in hand-to-hand combat in Czechoslovakia. So, I think because of where we are culturally, World War II is quickly becoming one of those things that was a long time ago. So I remember for myself, that was my grandfather, both of my grandfathers, actually. And in Japan, it's definitely still a very real memory because of the bombs. And they pretty consistently say A-bombs, the A-bombs that fell. So on August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. Most major cities in Japan were bombed during World War II. Kyoto was the only exception to a major city that did not get partially destroyed during World War II. The day that the bomb fell, they were expecting a bomb. And because they were expecting a bomb, they had teenagers out clearing fire rows or a fire line because they were expecting fire bombs. The way they constructed their homes meant that they were especially flammable, and their buildings. So their children were out getting ready for fire bombs. Several young children had been sent out to the monasteries surrounding the city to keep them safe from the bombs they were expecting. When the A-bomb was dropped, it destroyed a full mile radius, everything, except for this single building. And they only figured out a couple years ago, within the last 10 years, why this building survived. And it's because that dome at the top was a copper dome. And so when the bomb fell, it was so hot enough, it instantly melted that. And so the air rushed out, and it remained standing. This picture was taken from the bridge that was the original target of that bomb that has been rebuilt. Almost everything in the epicenter of the bomb was destroyed. As far as people, there were often no remains at all to recover. In the Peace Center, that is also the museum there, they had a piece of marble that was recovered where you literally had an outline of a body that was just disintegrated. The people who fled had their skin literally melting, and they invited people who survived to make art to help process their experience. And so those are hanging throughout the museum. Almost consistently, one of those things, you see the pictures of skin falling off and melting, and just these stories of intense pain. Outside of the blast zone, black rain fell that was also irradiated, radioactive, and the fires burned for hours across the city. The official death tolls were around 90 to 146,000, and those are probably a very low count. We don't have a good idea of how many people died from burns and radiation sickness following that. Many of those were not acknowledged by the government, so that has been an ongoing fight because of support services they might receive. People who survived the bomb are known as the hibakusha. And so that's everyone who survived in various ways, but there's considerable discrimination against the hibakusha. Many of them were never married because they didn't know, what diseases or things might happen. And the Japanese government now is wrestling with how do we care for these people in old age who have no family. Up until the 1980s, it was common for people to walk into the hospital still with glass coming out of their bodies, because when the glass was blown out, it just became projectile shards and it didn't surface for 40 years. And there are still dwindling numbers of people who survived, but still people who survived. I put cranes all around the windows on the tables because you might have heard about the cranes. You're welcome to take some of them home with you. I invite you to please take those. And those started from a young girl named Sadako Sasaki. She was 2 when the bombs fell. You might sometimes see her name Sasaki Sadako because Japan puts the family name first and the given name second, but for our purposes, we'll go with English style. She was 2 years old when the bombs were dropped, and she ended up severely irradiated. She was at home, and she was actually blown out of a window at her home, and was found the home was about a mile away from the epicenter. Her mom went and found her, and they were fleeing in the midst of black rain. In 1954, she began to show signs of leukemia, which was common among the surviving children. And for that leukemia, she was hospitalized in 1955. And she began folding cranes. There's a cultural legend that if you fold 1,000 of the paper cranes, you'll be granted a wish. So she was in her hospital room folding cranes, using whatever she could find since paper wasn't readily available, medical tape, and all sorts of things. She folded well over 1,000. Some books say she didn't get there, but they were adamant. She folded about 1,300 of the paper cranes before her death in October of 1955. And so after her death, friends and schoolmates wanted to raise funds to build a memorial to her, to other children who were victims of the bomb. So these statues were built. That's an image of her on the top with one of the cranes. Now, cranes are sent to Hiroshima every year from around the world. And I mean, millions and millions, literally tons of them, in hope for peace. They will display them for a while and then send them to other cities. There's artwork made out of cranes all around, including a quilt that someone made. And I purchased some note cards made out of recycled cranes that handicapped individuals make because they're still receiving those. And they also still say this is the world's hope for peace. There is still the question for them of what's next, and still a very real hope for nuclear disarmament. Where we were walking around where the bomb had dropped had been covered over with a full meter of soil. So again, about 3 feet of soil over this irradiated area. Obviously not as much as the Fukushima disaster, but still radioactive enough that it needed to be covered over. Underneath, everything was just there, a sort of graveyard. Whatever was still there was just covered over, pots and pans, all of those sorts of things. And so you know that you're walking on a graveyard, including there's a monument to the people we know who died, whose bodies were never recovered. And so one of the things that they want the world to know is that we don't know what would happen if an atomic bomb was dropped now. The ones we have now are about 100 times stronger than what was dropped on Hiroshima. So, having never done testing to see what that would really do, we don't know, but there's a decent conjecture that if it's 100 times stronger, it would do 100 times the damage. So at Hiroshima, a solid mile or 2 kilometers around was just flattened. If you did that math on Lincoln, Nebraska, that's what you're talking about with a 100-mile radius. Their black rain fell as far away as 10 kilometers, polluting the soil, polluting food, causing leukemia. The equivalent of that for 100 times is 300 miles. And if you went the full, that's kind of a conservative estimate. That is if you went the full 300 miles for 10 kilometers, or 600 miles for 10 kilometers, times 100 times what it would be today. So they want us to know that we don't know, the world does not know, if there were an atomic missile dropped, what it could do, but it could look incredibly horrifying for wherever it falls. And when I think of how many people, how much farmland is in with just that circle, it's a sobering thought for me. The Hiroshima Christians that we met with had this flyer. And it's a flyer from a missionary forum back in 2007. And they brought this saying, in 2007 we talked about this and we still want this to happen. They talked at an ecumenical gathering about the need for nuclear disarmament. They also talked more about their concern with the U.S. military presence. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says that they maintain a military only for defense. And many of the local Christians view the current agreements with the U.S. military and the presence there as a violation of their own constitution. They wanted us to fix that, which we don't have that power, let's just be clear. But it's an ongoing concern, including there's a military base near Hiroshima in a city called Iwakuni. And there, one of the things they do is test aircraft. And they're testing aircraft over residential areas. It's too loud, it's disruptive, and it's aircraft that they are not allowed to test over U.S. soil. They still fly them out of bases in California, but not over land. And so they're asking for the same treatment that we give our own people in terms of quality of life. But above all else, there's a deep longing for peace, a very real hope for nuclear disarmament over the world, and they would even say an end to militarism. And I will stop there for other questions, because there was nothing loaded there. Yes. Yep. Yeah, they are doing testing, and there are multiple U.S. military bases there. That one in particular is where they were doing the very noisy testing. When we get to Korea, the largest U.S. military base outside of the United States is in Korea.
So, in Japan, their military is not allowed, how do you do that?
They are for defense only. They are not allowed, they're not allowed to attack in any way. They are only respond to attack. And that has been true because of their own history. And so that's Article 9. The people we met with would say that the response has been they're basically under the umbrella of the U.S. military protection because of existing treaties. And many people would view that as a violation of their own constitution.
Part of that was enacted after everything with the signing of the papers on the battleship in Japan.
Yes. Some of these are long-standing. It has definitely, they view the more recent changes in military presence as the bigger problem, including the testing that is taking place in their country. Sally. And I would say not just a wiped out generation of Japanese that you're mentioning, but the Hibakushi who have continued to be a presence in society who weren't able to get married overwhelmingly, who are still needing health care. There's this ongoing, what does this mean? And, you know, radiation is something, how many years later does everyone get thyroid cancer? Because they saw that in their children. They saw increased cases of leukemia. And part of the fear, even with the Hibakushi, was if we have a child, what would happen to this child? What things might be passed on? So it is this ongoing question for them. And the Fukushima disaster kind of, I think, raised a lot of that again because of those already cultural realities and anxieties about futures there. Yeah, and they do not view their government as particularly responsive to their needs and desires. And one of the things was they recognized the power we had as people from the U.S. that might exceed their power, even though we're citizens. And we were like, we don't have those powers, but perceive that as so much more than what they even had to maybe stop this. Mm-hmm.
Sally, you made the comment about we did study it, but we don't, you know, it's not a reality for us. I am not sure that this generation is studying it in the way that we did. You know, World War II has kind of become a, you know, it was so far back that we don't study it in terms where, I mean, I can remember going to class and seeing pictures from concentration camps every day and things like that, and from the bomb and how the bomb affected Hiroshima. And I'm not sure that kind of thing is happening.
Yeah. There is significant cultural shift, I would say, for sure. And that's why I said my grandfathers fought in World War II. I'm 39. So people younger than me are definitely much more removed from those things. It's easier to forget when it's not here. That's one of those other realities that for them, it remains something very present.
And I'm 67 and it was my father.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it was that much closer
Yeah.
of a connection, but
Yeah.
We also, and I'm not trying to be unpatriotic, but we haven't done anything to change our military to even question how necessary and what their mission is, what their
So I am going to use that to segue to talk about Korea, because if you really want that conversation, let's talk about there. I was going to give you a break, but we've talked, so, you know, they said get up as needed, and I will stick with that. So Korea is about 30% or more Christian, heavily Christian, comparable to the U.S. in a lot of ways. South Korea is increasingly westernized and increasingly wealthy, very, very U.S.-driven in several ways. You will hear me talk about Korea, not South Korea, mostly out of the hope for a unified Korea that I will talk about later. Korea itself has been occupied in many ways throughout history, which shapes its reality differently. They remember the Joseon dynasty from 1392 to 1910 as like their last time of stability before being taken over. It wasn't quite that, which I'll get into later, but when World War II ended in 1945, Korea had been a Japanese colony for 35 years at that point. When that ended, they were divided into two countries along the 38th parallel, and then in June of 1950, the northern part invaded the southern part, starting the Korea War. The North was supported by China and the Soviet Union. The South was supported by the United Nations, led by the United States. And they reached an armistice agreement in 1953. The armistice agreement was not between North Korea and South Korea. It was between the countries behind those, so the United States, the UN, and China and Russia. So that matters a great deal to ongoing conversations. And part of the lasting peace was an establishment of the demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, between the two countries. Our partners in Korea are the Presbyterian Church in the Republic of Korea, They are similar to PCUSA. Like here, there's a more conservative branch of Presbyterians, the PROK, and but I would say the Presbyterian Church in Korea, they still carry forward a cultural conservatism compared to here. The church there is wealthy, is large, so we were there just before their equivalent of General Assembly. We were welcomed to their opening worship service as honored guests in a 5-story church building made out of marble. So we'll be talking more with Korea about broader strokes and themes because we were kind of honored guests rather than let's show you what we're doing in the same ways. So a bit of their history. This is Gyeongbokgung Palace, which is in Seoul. It was originally built in 1395 as the main palace for that Joseon dynasty. But when I say that was only kind of a source of stability, it was destroyed in 1592 when the Japanese army invaded and burned it to the ground. For 270 years, this palace was in ruins until a restoration project was started in 1867. And in 1867, they reconstructed or restored 500 buildings. And then the palace was destroyed again during the Japanese occupation, with about 90% of the buildings destroyed in 1915. 1990, this one was rebuilt. So it's very reflective of kind of what Korea has been through. Korea, unlike Japan, has no uncertainty about the abuse of women and the presence of comfort women. We were at the War and Women's Rights Museum. This is one of the statues of comfort women in that museum. You'll see the same statue throughout Korea as a reminder of what happened. When there's a statue, they're usually facing Japan, holding them accountable for the crimes that were committed. They're still holding protests every single Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy for a resolution of the issue of military sexual slavery by Japan. That is a direct quote. And they're hoping for admission of war crimes, a disclosure of the official documents about the establishment of the camps, an apology, reparations, the punishment of perpetrators, and education of the history of the issue in history textbooks. At the same time, they continue to work to end sexual violence during wartime. They have supported survivors of sexual violence that was committed by Korean soldiers, especially during the Vietnam War. And one of their reminders is that in modern warfare, it is more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier. And that is true the world over. They carry with them memory of young girls taken from their homes. And so they also carry with them art that was created by survivors throughout the museum. I know we stopped for questions earlier, and I am not as far as I thought I might be at this point, so I'm going to go to the next part, and then we'll stop for questions after that. Sexual violence, sexual slavery is not over, especially related to military presence. So about an hour south of Seoul, there's a town called Pyeongtaek, which is also home to Camp Humphreys, that is the largest U.S. military base outside of the U.S. It's about 2 hours south of the DMZ, and it was founded in 1950. One of sort of the signature programs of the National Church Women's Association for the Presbyterian Church is Dorabang, or my sister's place, is what it translates to. And it was founded in 1986 to help support the prostitutes who were there serving the military base. Originally, in 1986, they were still largely Korean women who were servicing the base. But now it's largely immigrants from poor countries. And so they end up trafficked to Korea, sometimes knowing what they are getting into, sometimes not. My sister's place will help them with counseling, with legal services if they need help getting out. They offer shelter and medical services, and they will help repatriate them to their countries. Most of them who are coming there are coming from poorer Asian countries nearby, and so it's not women from Korea. It's often people coming knowing that they might be working as a prostitute. Others are deceived, and regardless, they have no existing support in the country. With that, they run a shelter, my sister's house, and give women who want to leave a place to stay. They do assist with medical services. One of you already asked the question about, what about the children? We could not get an answer when we asked that question. They were not able to figure that out. Many of them who got pregnant would return to home countries, and they wouldn't know what else was going on. So questions? Michael.
So, if I understand correctly,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. military base is U.S. territory, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
To your knowledge, are we not doing anything on these bases to prevent this type of?
What they said, because we asked, so the town of Pyeongtaek is literally right up to the gates of Camp Humphreys. In Korea, nothing's in English. Everything's in Korean. They use a Hangul alphabet, which is relatively new, that they are happy to tell you how easy it is to understand. It's not. So outside, even in Seoul, it's mostly just in Korean. The one exception is Pyeongtaek, outside the military base. So you have brothels right outside, like you literally just have to walk across the street. When we asked, what they told us was their best resources had been chaplains with the U.S. military. But then the chaplain changes, and they have to start all over. So, we have a seminary student in care. We have two at South Point, and one of them is going to go to National Guard. And I was like, hey, heads up. You need to tell your guys that paying for sex is bad, and they shouldn't do it. Didn't know that was a thing, but they said the chaplains had been their best source, but hadn't gotten very far at all, and that would change.
I had a friend that was my age. Her parents, her dad was a U.S. military man, and fell in love with her mom, who is Japanese. It was not particularly easy to bring them to the United States. So there was not any, they were not encouraged to have committed relationships where they would know what happened to the women and the children.
Yeah, so I think that is very true. We're also talking about situations where women are being brought to service them who don't speak Korean, much less English. So there's really no possibility of what would that look like to have what would become a marriage, those sorts of things. And I have several friends who have immigrated, and yeah, it's complicated, and it's also not at all what the system is designed to do. The other part that factors into all of this is, whilst Korea is wealthy compared to the 80s, they feel a fragility to that. And in both Korea and US and Japan, US money goes a really long way. And what we're willing to spend on stuff proportionately is a lot of money to them. Because it was sometimes shocking of like how much money I didn't spend on something. traffickers. So there are brothels set up. I mean, it's like here. It's the massage parlor. It's the nail salon. Our Derek, the guy with Global Ministries, was like, yeah, don't go upstairs. If there's like a hall that says there's a massage upstairs, don't go up there. That's not a massage. Which is exactly what you would say here, right? So, yes. Mm-hmm. So my sister's place works to canvass the areas that they know where these women are. And so they have enough of a relationship with the police. If there's someone who needs help escaping, they can help get them out. They can help provide legal services. But it's not a just you walk out and you're done, in most cases. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That is a long, long conversation about human trafficking and what goes on, but suffice it to say we're not talking about conditions that we want replicated. Executive director of DWM, there's an interim executive director now. I don't know if that's been shared yet, but Deborah Reed, who was on this trip. So hopefully we'll get project underway. The hope was to support my sister's place. So this was where a lot of the women felt that there was good we could do, that there was fundraising we could help with. So that, I believe, will be the plan. We just got delayed a little bit. All right. Now you are going to get to hear about the most bizarre experience of my life, which is saying a lot, and that is visiting the DMZ. So the DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, is the area dividing North and South Korea. There is a line, and then there's a zone on each side. And in what feels like a very weird exported U.S. thing, the DMZ is now a tourist attraction. And so it's strictly controlled and those things, but while Koreans can't go to the DMZ, visitors to Korea can. And you just kind of find your tour based on what language you want the tour guide to speak. After we got on a bus in Seoul, and then we went to the park outside the DMZ where we bought tickets, and there's an amusement park there complete with a Ferris wheel. There are restaurants, 5 or 6 restaurants to get your snacks before you go in. There's a area to walk around, kind of a welcome center. There's a statue of a comfort woman there looking to Japan. There's a peace bell, like the one at Hiroshima, that you could ring in hopes of peace. But it's really bizarre because at this point, it's been there long enough, it seems like it's not going away. And that's a whole conversation there. But they're wrestling with what is it? It's kind of like a wildlife preserve because very few people go in or out. And when you do go in, it's a very structured version of it. They do say, but this maintains the peace. So I bought some cards, like greeting cards, at the DMZ gift shop inside the DMZ, which are back on that table. So take a look because it kind of incorporates all of that into it. I also bought a grenade-shaped or like little change purse because that seemed like the most bizarre thing they had, so I brought it home. But so visiting the DMZ, you start out on this bus after you have your tickets, after you've left the amusement park. You go through a check zone. They collect all your passports beforehand and check them. And then a guy, Korean soldier, gets on the bus and goes through and checks every person off their list, and then you go in. The first stop felt like a propaganda film, like weirdly like a propaganda film talking about the hope of the DMZ and kind of naming that like it's both peaceful, but you die if you go in, and maybe it's a wildlife preserve. So this very strange sort of video. We're all looking at each other like, is this real? What's going on here? And then the second stop is at an observatory, a very large observatory, where you can climb up and you can look into North Korea, which is here. I have several pictures taken from the top that are looking into North Korea, and it was the only time that I ever felt a little like off within anything on the trip, that there was kind of the like, am I safe? Is this something weird? And so our tour guide, Grace, who was quite lovely, as we're taking pictures and looking, she's like, look, it's North Korea, smile, you're on surveillance. I was like, she's like, they're spying on you. I was like, okay, thank you for letting me know. So that was very strange. And then a few months before we went, there was an American soldier that ran across the border. So we couldn't go to one of the stops. They had shut that down for security reasons. So our third stop then was at the third tunnel. So they have found 4 tunnels from North Korea into South Korea, where they would view this as military attacks were being attempted through these tunnels. And so the third tunnel is where the gift shop is, and it's the one that has been set up that you can actually go in. So it goes down at a steep incline about like this, all the way down into the tunnel that is now sealed off. And when they found it, there was a story about what it actually was, that this wasn't really that. People who've defected from North Korea to South Korea say there are more tunnels, but they know of 4. And so this is kind of an ongoing what happens there. It was so much of a security concern, they took our phones before we went in, and we had to go through metal detectors. And then we got our hard hats on the other side before walking down into this cavern. Very small, very narrow, and just kind of a testament to ongoing concerns and worries. But again, there's a gift shop then when you're done. So a very, very sort of strange experience. And they're wrestling with, what does this mean? What does this mean that there's this heavy military presence? What are we going to do going forward? And then we had one more stop. Our 4th stop was at the farmers market within the DMZ. So there's about 180 people who live within the DMZ and farm there. Apparently on the North Korea side, the same is true. And for them, that area is much better equipped than the rest of the country. You get electricity, you get a nice apartment, so it's kind of an honor to live there. There's about 180 people in South Korea, or I don't remember if it's people or households. And so they farm, you can stop and buy rice that was grown in the DMZ. You can't bring it back to the US, or I might have. And all grown by kind of that small population. So it's really, really quite bizarre. And one of the other things that might help you see how bizarre it is the photo opportunities that existed inside the DMZ. So there were a lot of these where you could stick your face into the soldier's uniform. That one's by the observatory, which is actually, you're looking into South Korea from there. There's also one at the tunnel. if you wanted some pictures there. And then there's this one where you get kind of they've chosen the flower and helmet motif often to talk about the DMZ. So you have a nice other picture opportunity there. And people do. Like, this is just kind of like, okay, let's take a picture, let's go, which I just found so bizarre. So incredibly bizarre. It's clear they have no idea what to do with it at this point. Told you, most bizarre experience of my life. The other part that I didn't put up here, I pulled out my phone and I was looking at the map. So already South Korea doesn't allow any tracking on your phone. So my Apple AirTags didn't work there, any of those things. I mean, it looked like we were in a field. So we're driving around all these places. Once you're inside that zone, there's no map that exists. Which makes sense, but is also a very strange feeling with kind of everything going on. But it also is their lives and country have been split apart because there's not a clear solution. I was telling someone earlier, the South Koreans kind of complain because the only way they can leave the country is by boat or by plane. And so they would like a high-speed rail like into China, but they can't do that. And they don't know what's next. And so that's where it matters for us that we talk about the fact that there is a longing for a unified Korea. I brought some of the sashes, things that are, say, Korean peace appeal on them. And that is the hope that there can be something. When I told you that armistice agreement exists between the forces that were backing North and South Korea, the people involved cannot end the war officially. And they cannot get rid of the DMZ or make any other agreements or do anything else without these countries agreeing that can happen, because they're the ones who signed the armistice. So they're kind of in a limbo there, and DWM at General Assembly collected signatures to support the Korean peace appeal, but this is one of those ongoing conversations. One of the other very, very strange things is we're told North Korea is a hermit nation. You can't visit there. Like, when I was setting up my bank accounts so that they would know I was traveling, I called my bank, so I'll be using my debit card. And the woman came back and she was like, "Oh, you can't use this in North Korea." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not going to North Korea, I know." But it was this, no, it's blocked out. And if you look on, U.S. travel, the government websites about warnings, they literally say, get your affairs in order because you're not coming back. In South Korea, we heard oh yeah, you could go, it's beautiful there. And we're like, what? And we're told even, your government doesn't want you to go, but you could visit. And I don't know who to believe anymore. It is kind of the which version is true. One of them even was straight up like, it's nice over there, and his family was originally from the north part of Korea. So I don't know. I'm not signing up for a trip anytime soon. But this talk about a unified Korea is very real to lots of people. And one of the reasons it is becoming more urgent is people are dying. The family members you haven't seen since before the Korean War are largely dead. Then the cousins you remember are dying, all of those sorts of things. And so families were divided in that, and there's no travel back and forth. And what the picture I put up here is a traditional North Korean noodle dish. and I don't remember what it was called. But this was one of the things the South Korean church leaders took us to eat because it was comfort food to them. Their families that were from North Korea had made this. This was what they grew up on. So it's buckwheat noodles. The sauce is the variation of how spicy it is. There's beef. And then an egg on top. And so, number one, this is served cold, and it's bad. Like there are many things I ate and was quite happy about. This was not one of them. There's cold, there's lots of it. The texture is not good. This was one person's portion. This was just mine. And that's kind of standard portion sizes. And you hear about portion sizes in the US. We've got nothing on Korea, let me tell you. But the church leaders all finished their entire bowl. And as they did, they talked about their mothers and grandmothers making this dish. And this was something that they remembered. And they are now worried that they will never get to go back in their lifetimes. They'll never get back to go back to where their families are from, and where parents and grandparents are buried in some cases. The older Koreans especially want a chance for peace. The younger Koreans are, while invested in getting a train across, they worry about what that would mean for their country. During the last 40 years, South Korea's wealth has increased considerably, and they worry about what it would be like if they tried to unify with this very poor northern country. But part of what we learned was, say, Korea, because South Korea, while it's a political reality, it's not the hope of a lot of people. And everyone is very aware of the political realities. So they know that just making one country again might not be what happens. They're hoping for different solutions, including something like the European Union, where they might be able to trade currency easily, where they could travel fairly freely within those countries, even while maintaining separate governments. So they're both open to conversation and wishing that was a possibility, which is not until outside countries say they can go there. So the Korean peace appeal is a lot about getting a chance to figure out if they can live together, if they can reunify their country that has been torn apart for about a century now, when you count everything together. So what other questions do you have about this, about others?
I guess when I thought about the DMV, I thought about fences and guards and, and you're saying it's a whole zone where people live.
Yep, not many people live. Because there's so few people, they're saying the DMZ is also a bit of a wildlife preserve in functionality. There's a West Wing about this, if you're a West Wing fan. There's a West Wing about everything. It's a running joke for me. So it is that, like, this could happen. At any moment there could be an incursion. But I think that's the living with it. Well, what do we do with this undeveloped strip that's here? That has people going, hundreds of people going in and out daily. So,
Is it the whole width of the country?
Entire width of the country, yeah.
So people know, we're not supposed to go.
Yes, and there's a fence with razor wire. It's patrolled the entire way. The Korean soldier who got on looked like he was about 19, but that's part of their military function. And yeah, it is also one of the only, it also is full of landmines, so people are not going there willingly. Yes?
Is there communication, families having people on both sides, are they able to communicate with each other?
From what I heard, people, if there were families in North Korea and South Korea, they had not been able to communicate with each other. one of the leaders who was there with us, they had met with North Korean Christians as part of, in China, as part of like a summit between them, but they had never then gotten to go back to their, what was their family's homeland. They were also very adamant that, you know, yeah, there are Christians in North Korea, of course there are, and there are Buddhists and all of these different religions represented there. Yes, I'm glad I was able to take the trip. I would definitely go back to Japan before I went back to Korea. Korea, culturally, there were some other things going on that just stressed me out in a different way. Japan was incredibly accommodating and welcoming in many, many ways. They would go out of their way to make sure you had what you needed. Because it's a communal culture, they also, they would go out of their way to not scam you or anything that might be related to that. So we went to Tokyo Tower, and it's like the Eiffel Tower. You can go up, there's observation decks. And so they're buying, I wasn't the one buying tickets, but someone was buying tickets, and we were gonna go up to the top, and they're like, oh no, you don't want to go to the top. It's foggy, you can't see anything. Well, that's the more expensive ticket. They would only sell us tickets to the main deck, since that was where you would be under the, so I mean, even this tourist attraction, they're like, oh no. And people who spoke English would stop and make sure you had what you needed and all of those sorts of things. So, and Seoul itself is just huge and kind of busy, and because it has such a heavy tourism area for people from the rest of Asia, you know, you might have someone who can speak Thai, but not English. So you get it much harder to navigate, even though they've got 7 languages written here, just one of them doesn't happen to be English. Yeah. Bathrooms? Everything is westernized, super clean, amazing. They get full doors on their stalls. They also, in Japan, have little signs, also in English. If you are in here longer than 30 minutes, we'll come and check on you. And they have emergency buttons and those things. The harder part to navigate was actually hotel bathrooms, because they don't do overhead showers, they do handheld showers. And you've probably heard of Japanese toilets with bidets and everything. They have a mini electronics panel on the toilet, some of which have pictures, but you're sitting with your phone on Google Translate trying to figure out how to flush. And the farther out of Tokyo, the farther out of cities you were, when we were visiting ARI, you run into fewer people who speak English, so there's also not a lot of translation. You just kind of hit buttons and hope for the best.
Did you get a chance to see where, normal Japanese person, where they live and I've heard that their living space is so much smaller than we think of a living space. And they are very, very tidy and very, there's a very small space that you have for living.
We did not go into any private homes. I can say from going by them that yes, they have to be small inside. The cultural kind of perceptions that we have of very clean and tidy, across the board is true. Everything, even the cities. They're immaculate. There's no trash anywhere. We were on the bullet train a lot of the time, and everything there is perfectly clean. There's no trash anywhere. You're never concerned about safety. The vending machines are as amazing as they say. You can get a hot drink or a cold drink. You can get go to 7-Eleven and you can eat a gourmet meal. It's great. So those things were true, but we didn't go in private homes. Public places would have often offered Japanese or Western style. So you did hit some of you take off your shoes when you go into a restaurant and they have slippers. Or we had slippers with us, one of the two. ARI, every space you went into, you took off your shoes, and they had little things for you to walk across if you were barefoot.
Even Kentucky Fried Chicken?
Yes.
I hear that's a big Christmas thing.
That's a big Christmas thing in Korea, so much so. I went to a seminary with a large Korean student population. They had the Luchi Korean Student Initiative. And so the first week when we were at new student orientation, I'm originally from Kentucky. So we're introducing ourselves, and I say I'm from Kentucky. I kid you not, at least 5 Korean students were like, oh, fried chicken. So we did eat fried chicken in a bar in Korea, and we over-ordered food. So there's also some very young Korean guys who got our plate of fried chicken and were ecstatic about it. So, yeah. Yes, many. Yes. So all of that is considered part of the Peace Park. That's on one edge, and the kind of museum Peace Center is on the other end of the field, and everything in between is that. So, yeah. So the statue of the little girl and all of that is all in the Peace Park.
Teresa, where are you at? When we were in Washington, D.C., was there not a lady that was living in a tent in that one park that had been part of the Hiroshima bombing? They didn't let anybody that was homeless live in that park, but she was living in that park, and it was kind of right in front of the White House, not too far from the White House. Yeah, well, but they weren't allowed to live in this park. The only person that was allowed to stay overnight in this park was that woman. And she has all her signs around, about the bombing and
Yeah.
but
I don't know. It's been a long time since I've been in D.C. So.
This was 19 years ago. 20 years ago.
She'd give you up to 10 years, but 19, no. Yes, Linda.
Was it a hard process for you to be accepted into this 10 group?
So it was not an incredibly hard process. They were intentionally trying to get some younger folks, and the younger ones were clergy because we were the ones who could go for 2.5 weeks. So that they had worked on, whereas most of the trip was older. I would say if you're looking to apply, they give you here are expectations. Take those expectations more seriously than maybe some group members did on packing less, being prepared to walk a lot, and those sorts of things. Because if you look at the amount of traveling we did, there's a lot of hauling your luggage and those sorts of things. So that would be my biggest thing. Take those seriously, and if you're yeah, there's no way on earth I can haul a suitcase up 2 flights of stairs, that's a no. Because you really might have to. I think the other thing that came up was different cultural perceptions of safety, which we hit. So one of our places was supposed to be a Western style. It was actually ended up being much more traditional Japanese hotel. And so you went in one door, and your bathroom was on the left, and the room was straight forward. The door that you initially went into did not lock. So there were some people who were like, well, no, people could just walk in. And I'm like, I wouldn't care. But I think those things were where we often hit the difficult places of what sets off your spidey sense? What do you think about? and where your comfort is or isn't with those things. There is something about me, I don't know what it is, I didn't cultivate it, but I'll take it, that says don't mess with me. And like, I think of doing some of the European touristy places where they're usually very in your face and haggling. Like, I walked up, and I was much younger than I am now, and looked and walked away with no like attacking. So like, I don't know what it is, I don't know what I put off, but I think even knowing those things, I have a very high comfort level. If you know you don't, that's one of those things that it's not going to be so great, because you're going to be put in lots of weird situations and lots of navigating in not a shared language, even with a very well-planned trip. Our hosts were great. They would, especially in Japan, like actually both places, they would meet us one place to get us to the next place. They would take care of calling the taxis and making sure they had our destination so that we got where we were going. And Minji Kim is one of the people that we met with in Korea. And there was, when we were lost in that 5-story church, because we were there early, like Minji gets off an elevator and we're like, yay, we're saved. You can get us there. But that's just part of travel. It's worthwhile to do it, so yeah.
We see pictures of city in Seoul.
Mm-hmm.
And the noises and the different forms of traffic and motorcycles weaving in it. Of course, that happens in the winter too.
Yeah.
Weaving in and out, and I mean, is it an overwhelming? And things open 24 hours a day everywhere. Is that an overwhelming?
So I have lived in Atlanta and Phoenix, so I have a pretty high tolerance for some of those things. One of the bonuses is I would not rent a car and drive. Public transportation, taxis are great because they then navigate a culture they're used to. And public transportation is almost all available in English. All of their screens will switch to English. You can read maps in English. So you get tools that are really helpful to navigate on your own. And like the Sunday we were in Korea, we were doing afternoon worship, so I decided I wanted to go to church. So between Google Translate and the public transportation, I found a church that had a service in English that was like 3 stops away on the subway, and I got someone to go with me, and we made it there. So you've got more tools than you did at one time, and westernized countries where they work. I know some of the women-to-women have been kind of remote areas where your cell phone's not going to work. That changes things compared to a very accessible westernized place where the toilet's all flush, for example. It is 5 till, so I'm guessing Angie has instructions and